Two men of the 1st Platoon kept on going, however. Sergeant Melvin Higgins and Private Arthur Contreras moved far ahead of their companions and dropped into a shell hole near two Japanese buildings. They radioed that they needed explosives to assault the buildings, and the company's executive officer came up with some blocks of Composition C. They made charges by putting the explosive into gas mask carriers. Higgins and Contreras then ran forward and delivered the charges to one of the buildings. They heard the roar of the explosions, but nothing happened. They saw two Japanese machine guns near one building and directed a tank to them. The tank moved forward, and a white flag came up, but the tank began firing on the guns. Higgins moved up and found a dozen Japanese in a camouflaged ditch behind the guns. All of them were dead. Whether they really meant to surrender or were only trying to trick the Americans, no one would ever know, as Higgins and Contreras moved against the shelter. So had two other small groups. Staff Sergeant Roland Harty and Private First Class Solteros Valenzuela came up from the 1st Platoon, and a patrol of 10 men came from the 2nd Platoon. Harty and Valenzuela approached the shelter, and Harty tossed a grenade in the door. They sprinted back into the brush and waited. Just as the grenade exploded, Private First Class Harold Pratt of the 2nd Platoon came up from the other side and threw a satchel charge in the door, then ducked back to the patrol. The charge exploded and routed a stream of Japanese, who came out screaming, firing rifles, and hurling grenades at the shell holes 20 yards away, where the 2nd Platoon's patrol was hiding. With the noise, Sergeant Harty and Valenzuela jumped and dove for the shell craters to join their fellow soldiers. The firefight lasted 10 minutes, with guns popping and grenades flying in both directions. A Japanese machine gun opened up from somewhere behind the shelter. Other Japanese suddenly surfaced from under wreckage and behind trees. At the end of the 10 minutes, the Americans had killed all the Japanese who had come from the shelter, but the leader of the 2nd Platoon Patrol, Sergeant Warren Cannelly, had been killed, and so had 2 of his men. Several others were wounded, including Valenzuela. The incident seemed to have stirred up a hornet's nest. Japanese kept appearing in all directions and firing on the patrols. Pratt crawled back to find Captain White, who sent 2 tanks to help. The tanks soon dislodged or killed all the Japanese in the immediate area, but the advance had been thoroughly stalled by this time, and the casualties had been high. The 2nd Platoon's 10-man patrol had only 2 men left on their feet. Company A, working to the right of Company B, moved into the Navy headquarters area and came up against several blockhouses and shelters that had not been destroyed by the artillery. There was no way to go except through the area, for Company B was on the left, and the 32nd Regimental Combat Team was on the right. Without strong weapons support, the company could not go forward either. So by 11:30, the 184th Drive was bogged down. A new plan was made, and by 1:30 that afternoon, the troops were ready to move again. This time, the 184th would begin at the middle of the island and push the defenders toward the lagoon, stopping at the point, Noel Road, where the island suddenly narrowed. The 32nd would drive straight along to the end of the island. Thus, the 184th would clear out the whole Navy area, which seemed to be so heavily defended, while the 32nd finished the capture of the tip of the island. In operation, it was a different story. The 184th became thoroughly confused, and the companies did not coordinate their attacks. The result was a string of small actions, with patrols and squads routing out small knots of Japanese. It was slow going, and an hour before dark it was apparent that General Corlitt's call for the capture of the island was not going to be delayed just a few hours, but another day. To a lesser extent, the 32nd faced the same difficulties, and as darkness settled on Kwajalein, the American troops stopped and dug in along a ragged line 3/4 of the way to the end. The night of February 3rd was an eerie one for the men of the 7th Division. They had bypassed scores of Japanese during the day, and so the troops were intermingled. The officers could not call for artillery fire on Japanese positions, for the shells were likely to fall in American positions. Wherever a light shone, the Japanese opened fire with rifles, mortars, and grenades. Japanese prowled all night long in various areas. On the 32nd's front, a group of Japanese staged a banzai charge. On the 184th's front, the Japanese charged 5 different times. Each of these was broken up by the rifle companies and supporting artillery fire. But at 4 in the morning, a group attacked again. More attempts were made by the enemy to infiltrate the lines. The last Japanese attack was staged at 5:30 a.m. by about 40 Japanese against the line of Company E of the 184th Infantry. The machine guns began firing, and the attack stopped. As the light grew bright, the men of Company E counted 30 Japanese dead in front of their position. Offshore, Admiral Turner's commanders were growing restless at the delay. The fast carriers departed for Majuro to refuel, leaving a handful of escort carriers to support the troops. Most of the transports were unloaded. The garrison was landing, and garrison troops undertook the general defence of half the island. Everyone, it seemed, was waiting impatiently for the army to finish its job. As the morning of February 4th dawned, the army troops still had to take a stretch of land 1,000 yards long and 400 yards wide, containing the ruins of about 30 buildings and a few strong points amid groves of trees. It seemed a straightforward task, given the strength of troops, the guns, and the tanks. But General Corlett did not know how ragged the American line had become on February 3rd. Before the Americans could make a controlled advance, they had to clear out the Japanese who had been bypassed and threatened their lines of communication. This need became apparent when the 32nd's 1st Battalion was moved forward to pass through the lines of the 3rd Battalion and carry the assault. As the troops came up in the darkness to take position, they passed a Japanese shelter and could hear the enemy soldiers talking inside. The column marched right by the shelter, and as the last men appeared, out charged 4 Japanese, screaming and hurling grenades. A Japanese officer came up swinging with a samurai sword and threw a grenade from 30 feet away. The Americans could see the sparks as it sailed toward them. They scattered, but the explosion wounded 2 men. These Japanese were all killed, but they had shown what the Americans would face all morning. When the attack was launched, it started as raggedly as might be expected. The troops could not move forward without stopping to clear out Japanese positions, and each one took time. At 10 o'clock, the 1st Battalion began to reach positions it was supposed to have made by 7 o'clock. In the 184th sector, the confusion was even greater. One company was still following the battle plan of the day before, which stalled the company that was supposed to come through and take over the assault. All along the line, it was a case of advancing from one pillbox to the next, flushing the Japanese out and moving on. From one large shelter, they captured 31 Korean labourers and 1 Japanese. Using loudspeakers and captured prisoners, the troops began trying to talk the Japanese into surrender. Nisei interpreters managed to persuade 90 to surrender to the 184th. In the south, the 32nd moved slowly, even more slowly than the 184th, since it had a greater distance to cover. By noon, the 1st Battalion had bogged down, and the 2nd Battalion passed through at 1:45 to take up the battle. Again, it was a case of slow motion, from one pillbox to the next, using grenades, tanks, satchel charges and flamethrowers to rout out the enemy. At 3:15, the 1st Platoon of Company G reached Nero Point, the end of the island, and the men sat down on the beach for a smoke. But on the other side, the 3rd Platoon was still encountering enemy resistance, especially from 3 long concrete shelters placed side by side. Staff Sergeant Raymond Barucki led the attack with satchel charges. He was planning then to bypass the shelters, but Private Elmer Collins and Private First Class Franklin Farr crawled into one shelter and found a number of live Japanese inside. They backed out in a hurry, firing as they went, and threw in grenades. The Americans stopped then and cleared out the shelters. It took half an hour for each one. All the way, the troops faced stubborn Japanese resistance. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the fighting still continued. Captain Albert Pence of Company G, walking over to talk to Captain Mark Barber of Company F, was shot down by a sniper just then, and the advance was stopped until tanks came up 20 minutes later to drive the last of the enemy out of hiding. At his command post, General Corrigan was so eager and so chagrined at the slowness of progress that at 4:15 he had already announced the end of organised resistance. The troops were just mopping up, he said. It was true in a sense. Organised resistance had never really materialised on the island. From the beginning, it had been almost a question of mopping up, but that term, when applied to the Japanese defenders in the Pacific theatre, was almost meaningless. As they had shown at Tarawa and again on Kwajalein, they could and would exact a price in blood for every foot of ground gained. On this last day on Kwajalein, the army casualties were higher than on any other day. 65 soldiers were dead and 252 wounded. It was a high price, but there was no escaping it if the island was to be taken. And on this last day, as the Americans moved forward, they were assailed by the stench of rotting bodies in this strongly defended area. The smell was a reminder of the efficacy of the naval bombardment. Had it not been for the extreme care taken in the preliminaries, it was obvious that the price of victory would have been far higher than it turned out to be. There was other action, not nearly so heralded, in the capture of Kwajalein Atoll. Most important was the assault on Aba Island, undertaken by the 17th Infantry on February 3rd. It took 2 days and cost the regiment 89 casualties. About 500 Japanese troops were killed and 7 were captured. The army men captured Loy Island, where about 40 natives joyfully submitted to capture, and a small unnamed islet below it, where 20 Japanese and Korean sailors had to be manhandled. The troops worked up and down the circular chain of the atoll, making sure that all the Japanese on every bit of sand or land were killed or captured. On February 6th, the last shot was fired, and Kwajalein Atoll was entirely in American hands. In the south, the battle had been fought bravely by 5,000 Japanese defenders who knew from the outset that they had no chance of victory and almost no chance of survival. In fact, 79 Japanese did survive as captives, and that was all. The Americans also wanted Eniwetok Atoll, for it had the second largest lagoon in the Marshall Islands, and Admiral Nimitz knew it would be necessary to give shelter to all the ships he intended to send westward in the drive against the Japanese Inner Empire. Nimitz had expected to regroup after the capture of Kwajalein and then consider Eniwetok. That reasoning indicated the big problem of Pacific Command in the winter of 1944, still a shortage of ships. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had authorized General MacArthur to invade Kavieng in the Bismarcks, about 500 miles northeast of New Guinea. The fast carriers would have to be sent off to support this operation, and so would many of the escort carriers and the ships of Admiral Turner's amphibious force. They could not be in 2 places at one time, and there were not enough to stage 2 invasions simultaneously. But the Kavieng operation was not scheduled for several weeks, and the capture of the Marshalls was well ahead of schedule. Just before Admiral Spruance had left Pearl Harbor, he had suggested to Admiral Nimitz that it would be possible, if they moved quickly, to take Eniwetok on the heels of Kwajalein. On February 2nd, with Majuro captured, the idea became a reality. The fighting at Roy Namur and Kwajalein indicated that the 8,000 reserve troops who had been brought along would not be needed, and the amphibious tractors which were in such short supply had done their jobs and were available, so there was no reason to wait on Eniwetok. Rear Admiral Harry Hill was flown in from Majuro to confer with Admiral Spruance and Admiral Turner. That done, Admiral Hill went back to his own flagship, the Cambria, and began planning with Brigadier General T.E. Watson of the Marines, who would take charge of the invasion as soon as the troops landed. This change was precisely what the Marines had always wanted. Holland Smith had been grumbling since the Gilberts about Admiral Turner's insistence on keeping command until the beachhead was established. So the hurried planning was carried out in an atmosphere of great goodwill. The Eniwetok invasion offered several specific problems. First was the need to neutralize enemy air power. After the Kwajalein invasion, the Americans could expect a reaction from the Japanese, who would have been building their resources in the south and to the north. The big problem was Truk, the major Japanese base 670 miles southwest of Eniwetok. The journalists called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz had a more earthy description, the Japanese cojones. Both epithets suggested the real respect in which the Americans held the fortress base, largely because they knew so little about it. The Japanese had fortified Truk years earlier, that much was known. But as with all the mandated islands under Japanese control, specific military information was hard to come by. Eniwetok, for example, was very much an unknown quantity. A secret Japanese chart of the atoll had been found aboard an abandoned tug on Gare Island, but it did not show any defences. About Truk they knew even less, except that the Japanese fleet was housed there when in the south, and that its air forces were formidable. The air forces were what concerned Admirals Hill, Turner and Spruance. Of course, they were not unmindful of the Japanese fleet, still based at Truk. Altogether it was clear that an airstrike was in order. As for Eniwetok itself, Admiral Hill at first anticipated little trouble. His best sources indicated the presence of only about 700 Japanese among the 30-odd islets of the atoll. But at Kwajalein, the army captured documents that indicated the presence on Eniwetok of the 1st Amphibious Brigade. The troop estimate was raised to 4,000. Original photographs, taken before the Kwajalein invasion, indicated that only the main island of Engebe was fortified, but photos taken during the invasion indicated that fortifications had been extended to Parry and Eniwetok Islands in the southern part of the atoll. Even so, the Engebe invasion was to be a much less formidable and less spectacular show than either assault in Kwajalein. Admiral Oldendorf's fire support group of 3 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, and 7 destroyers was retained. Hill would rely more heavily on carriers. Rear Admiral Samuel Cinder's task group of 3 carriers, Saratoga, Princeton and Langley, would be buttressed by 3 escort carriers. Since the Eniwetok invasion had not been contemplated for so early a date during the Marshal's planning, no troops had been especially trained for the task. The major units were the 106th Army Infantry, commanded by Colonel Russell Ayres, and the 22nd Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Colonel John T. Walker. The 106th was a part of the 27th Division and had not participated in the Gilbert's invasion. The 106th was supposed to have invaded Nauru at that time, but the Nauru operation was called off, and so was the 106th's amphibious training. The 22nd Marines had been stationed in Samoa since 1942, and their training in the new methods of warfare was also extremely limited. Most of them had never seen an amphibious tractor. After several misfires, the date of the invasion was set for February 17th. Already Admiral Sherman's carriers had hit Engebe hard during the invasion of Kwajalein, destroying all the planes present on the airstrip that day. Admiral Cinder's carriers stood off Eniwetok on February 3rd, and for 4 days the bombers and fighters worked over the atoll. They returned to Roy on February 7th to refuel and rearm, but went back to strike twice more between February 11th and 13th. Everyone in the Central Pacific was conscious of the need to suppress Japanese air activity, particularly after February 12th. On that day, the Japanese struck back at the Marshalls. 6 big Kawanishi flying boats from Saipan bombed the Roy airfield at 2:30 in the morning. The Japanese airmen were probably as surprised as anyone when the whole centre of the island seemed to explode. They had hit the one huge dump into which the overconfident Americans had put all the supplies for the island garrison, and the explosions and fires destroyed 80% of the material. For 2 weeks, the defenders of Roy lived on emergency rations until shipments could be brought from Pearl Harbor. Mindful of the ongoing destruction, Admiral Hill made doubly sure that Admiral Mitcher would carry out the airstrike on Truk before the Eniwetok invasion reached a critical stage. The carrier men were as eager to strike Truk as they had ever been on any operation, particularly after aerial reconnaissance showed major elements of the Japanese combined fleet stationed there. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, numerous destroyers, submarines, and dozens of merchant ships. Photographs also revealed that the 6 major islands of Truk Atoll were teeming with airplanes. The day after the bombing of Roy, the fast carrier task force set out for Truk. Admiral Mitcher was accompanied by 9 of his carriers, 3 were held back to cover Eniwetok, and the fast battleships and cruisers that would protect the carriers from surface enemies and could also attack the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose. Before dawn on February 17th, the Americans struck. More than 70 fighter planes appeared at sunup over the Japanese airfields. Zeros and other Japanese fighters rose to meet them, but about 30 were shot down while the Americans lost only 4. The enormous superiority of the F-6F Hellcat was already evident. Some American fighters were tasked with strafing the airfields, destroying more planes on the ground. As they returned to their carriers, bombers loaded with fragmentation bombs and incendiaries arrived to target the airfields and plane storage areas. The strike was entirely effective. Later, the Americans estimated that there had been 365 Japanese aircraft on the fields of Truk Atoll, with all but 100 destroyed. To temper the airmen's elation, however, came a significant disappointment. Following the capture of the Gilberts in November, Admiral Koga had grown concerned about having the combined fleet so far south and close to the enemy. When it became apparent on February 3rd that the marshals were also lost, he ordered the fleet to abandon Truk and sail 1,000 miles west to the Palaus to base there. Consequently, when Admiral Mitcher's carrier planes arrived over Truk, the fleet had already departed, leaving behind only a handful of destroyers, some service ships, and 2 auxiliary cruisers, converted merchant ships in the harbours. Nevertheless, there were enough ships to provide many targets. The carriers dispatched their bombers, loaded with torpedoes and bombs, to strike the ships all day long. Over 2 days they flew 1,050 sorties and dropped 400 tons of bombs on ships and 94 tons on airfields and shore installations. In total, they destroyed 200,000 tons of Japanese shipping, including a destroyer, the 2 auxiliary cruisers, and half a dozen tankers, likely the most valuable ships in the harbour from Japan's perspective. The Japanese did retaliate on the first night. At Truk, they had some planes equipped with radar. One of these managed to torpedo the carrier Intrepid. Although the Intrepid did not sink, 11 men were killed, 17 were wounded, and the carrier was out of action for the next 6 months. While the carriers targeted the harbours and airfields, Admiral Spruance, who had taken charge of the entire operation, led the surface ships on a run around the islands, hoping to catch some warships as they escaped. Accompanied by the new battleships New Jersey and Iowa, the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, and the destroyers Izard, Burns, Bradford, and Charette, they found a prize. The Japanese light cruiser Katori and destroyers Maikaze and Nowake had escaped the confined waters of the atoll and were steaming away. They were first spotted by carrier planes and attacked by them, but the surface ships took over. It was hardly a battle, 2 battleships and 2 heavy cruisers against a light cruiser. Admiral Spruance ordered the Minneapolis, the New Orleans, and 2 destroyers to sink the light cruiser. As they approached, the cruiser was already badly damaged by the bombs of the carrier planes. They finished her off in about 15 minutes. The Japanese crew of the Katori fought valiantly, manning the guns as long as they were above water and launching all her torpedoes. Even as she rolled over and sank, her 5-inch guns aft continued firing. The 2 American battleships and 2 destroyers then pursued the destroyer Maikaze, but she seemed almost indestructible. Shells hit her repeatedly, yet she remained afloat and continued to fire back. She launched a spread of torpedoes, which were well aimed, but a carrier plane warned the American ships of their approach, allowing them to avoid them. The Maikaze went down at 1:41 in the afternoon, marking the near end of the surface action. The Americans had concentrated so much of their superior firepower on these 2 ships that the destroyer Nowake managed to escape and was 20 miles away before the battleships discovered it. They began firing, but the distance was too great, and the Nowake got away to tell the tale of the unequal struggle off Truk. Following this battle, for the first time during the war, Radio Tokyo raised the spectre of possible Japanese defeat. "The attacking force is already pressing upon our mainland," one broadcast declared. This was a significant shift from the jingoism that had characterized Japanese government statements for years, as the Japanese people had been fed propaganda since childhood that their nation was destined to rule the 8 comers of the earth. At Eniwetok, Major General Yoshima Nishida was preparing for the expected attack. The defeat at Kwajalein and the subsequent heavy bombing of his own atoll left no doubt that the Americans were moving against Eniwetok. General Nishida had very little with which to work. Arriving only on January 4th with about 3,000 troops assigned to Eniwetok's defences, he had 100 additional defenders sent from the Eastern Marshal's airfields. After the initial series of air attacks in January, the Japanese High Command had ordered all pilots and air crews with destroyed planes to move to rear areas. The Japanese were well aware that one reason for their growing air inferiority was the quality of their pilots. Since the disaster at Midway, where 4 carriers had been sunk and all their planes lost, the Japanese Naval Air Service had not recovered. Pilots were considered a precious resource, but those 100 men trapped on Eniwetok would have to perish there. Having studied American amphibious techniques, General Nishida knew what to expect. He constructed his defensive positions on the lagoon side of the islands, knowing the Americans preferred to approach from that direction. Lacking reinforced concrete or steel plating for defense, his men built trenches and dugouts protected by coconut logs. They had enough cement to build thick concrete pillboxes. Anticipating that the Americans would first attack the outlying islands and then use them as a base for artillery to prepare for the main assault, Nishida placed additional troops on Little Parry Island, north of Eniwetok. The strongest defences were constructed on Engebe, which held the airfield. Although Nishida could not build fortresses as he would have liked, he made effective use of camouflage. Given the paucity of their communications, the Japanese had remarkably accurate information about the American attack. However, this would not help much, as the only coastal defence guns were a pair of 4.7-inch British antiques mounted on the northern tip of Engebe. Nishida had some anti-tank mines placed in strategic positions and beach mines, but lacked the trained manpower and time to establish underwater defences. The troops were equipped with standard infantry weapons, machine guns, and mortars, with the ultimate expectation that they would die gloriously for their emperor. On February 15th, Admiral Hill's Eniwetok Expeditionary Group sailed from Kwajalein Lagoon. The force had been slightly altered. Admiral Oldendorf's fire support force consisted of the old battleships Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Tennessee, the heavy cruisers Indianapolis, Portland, and Louisville, and 15 destroyers. On February 17th, the force approached Eniwetok and navigated southeast to the channel known as Deep Entrance, which runs between Japtan and Parry Islands. Oldendorf's battleships opened fire on Eniwetok and Parry, but the Japanese gave no sign of life. General Nishida had issued strict orders that no one was to give the enemy any indication of troop disposition. Nishida remained in his headquarters on Parry Island, waiting. Encountering no opposition, the naval force brought in the minesweepers, which worked over Deep Entrance and Wide Passage on the southwest side of Eniwetok Island. The sweeping effort was rewarded. For the first time in the Central Pacific Campaign, the sweepers discovered a minefield inside Wide Passage. They spent 2 hours clearing a channel for the big ships. Then the Tennessee passed through, followed by transports loaded with 8,000 troops. The invasion was already 2 hours behind schedule. Matters worsened. A submarine chaser assigned to guide the convoy to Little Aitsu Island, where the Marine artillery was to land, mistakenly stationed off the wrong island. The Marine artillery got mixed up, causing a further 3-hour delay. Aboard the Cambria, tempers flared. Colonel Ayres, commander of the 106th Infantry, requested Admiral Hill to allow him to land his own artillery on one of the small islands. This was standard army procedure, and though he did not state it, the colonel would have preferred the army's guns over the navy's. Admiral Hill rejected the request, arguing it would delay the invasion by most of another day. The Navy and Marines had already caused significant delays. Colonel Ayres' dissatisfaction increased, and Admiral Hill, frustrated by the situation, grew so angry that he relieved the captain of the subchaser. General Watson relieved his artillery commander. Admiral Hill sent a harsh message of criticism to Captain D.W. Loomis, an officer with far more experience in amphibious landings than his critic. In reality, the outbursts aboard the Cambria were unnecessary. The first day's objectives were met despite the Japanese reluctance to engage. The Marine and Army guns were landed safely on Eitsu and Rujoru islets, and they fired their sighting rounds before dark. The next morning, American troops were to invade Engebe Island, where they anticipated stout resistance. In reality, their intelligence was sadly mistaken. The total garrison of Engebe consisted of about 1,050 men under Colonel Toshio Yano. The weapons at his disposal included 2 flamethrowers, 13 grenade launchers, 12 light machine guns, 4 heavy machine guns, 12 mortars, 6 field guns ranging from 20mm to 12mm, and 3 light tanks. Although not much of a defence, Yano was certainly competent to make the best use of it. A week earlier, he had predicted the manner in which the Americans would come: bombardment, followed by heavy ship fire on the island, and then landings on the lagoon side. Colonel Yano's defence would then concentrate on the lagoon side. His men were moved to this shore, with half the detachment concentrated in the centre. The beach approaches were flanked by 2 75mm mountain guns on the northwest corner, and 2 20mm rapid-fire guns, and 2 37mm guns on the south. The front on the beach was covered by 37mm guns in the 3 tanks, along with light and heavy machine guns. 3 other strong points were established, one on each corner of Engebe, which is triangular. Along the lagoon beach, Yano had utilised his resources as best as he could. He had built concrete pillboxes reinforced with coconut log embrasures. The concrete was only a foot thick and incapable of withstanding armour-piercing shells. Despite this, he had commanded the construction of trenches and connecting tunnels. His efforts were hampered by the condition of his men. After the Japanese High Command redrew the defence line in the fall of 1943, supplies and medicines continued to diminish. After the capture of the Gilberts, supplies had been nearly cut off. To add to Colonel Yano's woes, a succession of American air raids had killed and wounded many men, increasing the tension among the survivors. On the night of February 17th, the American Navy's underwater demolition men swam around the little island flanking Engebe to ensure there were no obstacles and that there were no Japanese on the bits of land. There were none. Everything was set for the landings the next morning. Just before 7:00 a.m., the Navy guns opened up, and an hour later an airstrike was staged on the island. When it ended, the guns resumed firing, joined by artillery from the shores of the 2 little islands. At 9:30, the landings began. The troops who came ashore at Engebe were the Marines of the 22nd's 1st and 2nd Battalions, led by LCIs firing guns and rockets to discourage the defenders. Those defenders could scarcely be discouraged more than they already were. They had been left alone to die, and their commander had made that quite clear. In the past few days, their numbers had been reduced by 1/3 through the bombings, and of the 800 men who remained on their feet, half were scarcely fit for action. All that sustained them was the discipline of the Japanese military and their ingrained acceptance of the need to die fighting. The Marines landed easily. The worst loss occurred when a tank-carrying LCM, landing craft mechanized, lowered its bow ramp too soon, causing the craft to fill with water and sink in 40 feet of water. The tank crew had buttoned up. They had the hatches all locked, and apparently none of the crew heard the frantic shouting of the LCM crew. Only one tank man got out before the sinking. On the beach itself, opposition seemed very light. A few guns began firing from Skunk Point on the southeast corner of the island, but that was all. On the left, the 2nd Battalion moved swiftly, bypassing the pillboxes and leaving them for later cleanup. They overran the airfield in less than an hour. Tanks moved up to the northern part of the island. Half an hour later, the 3rd Battalion landed and was given the task of flushing the Japanese from the bypassed defences. These consisted of spiderweb fortifications, trenches fanning out from a central pillbox. The simple concrete was no match for 75mm guns, satchel charges, and flamethrowers. There was one area of strong resistance, the southeast corner of the island. The Japanese here put up stubborn fights, retreated along the northeast shore a little, and stopped to fight again. The Marine advance was hampered by the dense growth of underbrush, but on all sides the Marines kept moving. By 3 p.m. they reported the island secure. The Americans had expected Engebe to be the difficult operation, and the plan called for the capture of Parry and Eniwetok Islands the day after Engebe was secured. However, when the troops searched the papers on Engebe, they learned that the garrisons of the other two islands were stronger than expected. Several natives confirmed this finding, although none were quite sure of the actual numbers involved. This intelligence caused Admiral Hill to change the plan. The Army's 106th Infantry would attack Eniwetok as planned, but the invasion would require more troops, so Marine tanks and the Marine Regiment's 3rd Battalion would support the 106th's 3 battalions. The rapid change of plan did not fully percolate through the system. Admiral Hill and General Watson obviously felt that Eniwetok was going to be difficult, as 3 battalions were to be landed instead of 2. However, the bombardment of Eniwetok had been set up to be lighter than that of Engebe or Parry, and that part of the plan remained. The bombardment was carried out, followed by an airstrike, and then the troops landed. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Mizoni's 3rd Battalion was to land on the northwest side of the island, the widest area. Mizoni would then move to his right down to the southwest corner and control half the island. Lieutenant Colonel Winslow Comet, commander of the 1st Battalion, would land to the left of the 3rd Battalion and turn left, driving to the northeast end of the island. The troops reached the beach shortly after 9 o'clock a.m. and ran into trouble. The island rose sharply just behind the beach, and the amphibious tanks could not manage the slope. They dropped back and began to clutter the beaches. The Japanese opened fire, and the troops dropped behind the LVTs for protection. Behind them, the following troops began to back up and then come around the stalled area, which put them out of their assigned positions. The ease of the landing at Engebe had not prepared the invaders for the fierceness of beach opposition here. As at Tarawa, the defenders of Eniwetok had established fields of fire from well-concealed positions on high ground behind the beaches. Company B on the east side of the beach ran into difficulty when it encountered one of the spiderweb fortifications its men knew nothing about. This web was made up of a network of firing pits and radiating trenches, linked by underground tunnels and artfully concealed by vegetation camouflage. As the troops moved inland, the Japanese attacked from one flank and then scurried underground to attack from the other. Second Lieutenant Ralph Hills and Private First Class William Hollowiak were caught in the centre of the strong point. They lay prone and shot at the Japanese as they rose up in the firing pits. Hollowiak decided this was a slow method. He asked Lieutenant Hills to cover him while he moved forward, found a hole, fired into it with his M1, and then threw a grenade. He then covered Hills while he did the same at the next position. They ran out of ammunition, so Hollowiak picked up a Japanese rifle and searched Japanese bodies for cartridges until he had enough. They searched the American dead for grenades. They kept moving until they had knocked out 7 of the positions and neutralized the east side of the spiderweb. After a while, other troops arrived to help, bringing an amphibious tank and a 37mm gun. With these weapons, the spiderweb was soon clear of spiders. Lieutenant Hills pushed across the island to the other side. One of the most difficult landings was made by First Lieutenant Robert Bates's Company C. When the company came in on the 6th wave of landing craft, the beach was badly congested due to the backup of tracked vehicles. As a result, 4 boatloads landed west of their assigned area, and 3 of them came under heavy fire for the last 150 yards. The enemy had mounted machine guns on jutting points on both sides of their landing place, so the crossfire was intense. The Japanese also had mortars zeroed in on the beach, and when the Americans hid behind their boats, the mortars began firing. There were 53 men in those 3 boats. 20 were killed and 15 were wounded. The remaining 18 were saved by the advance of Company A along the lagoon shore, which flushed out the Japanese from the side and rear. This Japanese defence was more reminiscent of Tarawa than any action yet in the Marshalls. By noon, the front line of the 106th 1st Battalion wove like an S from the lagoon beach to the ocean side of the island. On the lagoon side, the men of Company A were facing a series of spiderweb defences, each of which had to be flushed out in a wearying process. On the ocean side, Company B and part of Company K had captured a Japanese position and were digging in. Along the S-line were elements of Company C, Company B, and Company K, intermingled with two 75mm guns. The Japanese suddenly counterattacked with a force of 400 men. The first indication, just after noon, was an intense mortar barrage laid down in the centre of the line. It was followed by troops firing and moving up. The Japanese charge broke the American line in several places, but the machine gunners held their positions and swept the field with fire, killing the enemy who had broken through. The machine gunners continued to hold and finally stopped the advance. The Japanese diverted their assault to the left side of the line, hoping to flank the Americans. They came up against parts of K Company and B Company. The machine gunners and riflemen engaged in hand-to-hand combat for a few minutes, some using knives and grenades. They held their ground, the Japanese attack lost its force, and the firing stopped. The Americans then continued their move west and discovered that they had landed and penetrated into the heart of the Japanese defences. General Nishida had expected the Americans to land at the broad west end of the island, and the defensive positions were in place to give the best protection to that end. By landing toward the end, but on the side, the Americans had threatened the Japanese positions from the beginning, which was why the counterattack had come so quickly. What they faced now, as the 1st Battalion tried to move west, was the centre of that line, made up of concrete pillboxes interconnected by trenches and tunnels. The American troops reduced one Japanese position after another, but were making no progress west. At 12:45, Colonel Ayres called for his reserves, the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Marines. Major Claire Schisler brought the Marines ashore at 2:25 and made contact on the line at 4:00 p.m. Within the hour, the offence began moving. By 6:30 p.m., the Marines had driven to the southwest corner of the island, leaving the army troops behind. As darkness began to lower, this gap became a serious problem, so Colonel Ayres adopted the unusual army tactic of ordering a night offensive. However, the army attack was confused, with Company A and Company B failing to reach the Marine right flank by 100 yards. At 9 that night, the Japanese attacked along the gap. They were repulsed, but not before they had succeeded in reaching the Marine command post. They killed 10 officers and men, including the battalion operations officer, Captain L.M. Clark. Sergeant C.E. Green was shot in the leg and fell. He saw Japanese all around him and played dead until their attention was diverted. Then he got up and mowed down 15 of them with an automatic rifle. He rallied the remaining men in the area, and they killed 7 more Japanese and routed the attack. The rest of the night was a nightmare for the Marines. They had learned how best to cope with Japanese tactics, beginning at Guadalcanal. At night, the Marines dug in and remained quiet, never firing their weapons unless necessary. They knew that unnecessary firing only gave away their positions. That was obviously how the Japanese had learned of the gap between the lines. For all evening the soldiers had been firing at anything that moved anywhere, including some Marines. The soldiers continued their senseless barrage all night long. When morning finally came, the Marines again carried the assault. The major Japanese position was a spiderweb at the southwest corner of the island. The army helped by sending up some tanks and a rifle company, but the Marines carried the day, took the position, and cornered 50 Japanese at the end of the island. When the enemy launched a banzai charge, the Marines cut them down like overripe wheat, and they lay like tired children with their faces in the sand. The battle for the western half of Eniwetok was over, or almost over. The 1st Battalion of the 106th still had one small pocket of resistance to overcome on the lagoon side by day's end. But there were so few Japanese in the position that they offered no problem. The Marines would not be needed. On the eastern side of the island, the troops of the 106th made such slow progress that even the riflemen despaired. "If only someone would tell us what to do," one soldier cried. But their officers did not know what to do, and so the 3rd Battalion drive was stalled time and again by tiny pockets of resistance that the Marines would have driven straight through. One light tank struck a landmine on the second day and lost a track. The men in the tank buttoned up and sat tight. Riflemen from the battalion came to try to rescue them, but the tankers would not listen to their calls, thinking they were Japanese. The patrol retired. Just before dark, the tank commander was so foolish as to open the hatch and crawl out to inspect the damage. As he hit the ground, a crowd of Japanese attacked, and he was wounded. He crawled under the tank and played dead. The Japanese came up and dropped grenades in the turret hatch. Only one man inside survived. The 3rd Battalion was ordered to advance that night, and at 2 a.m. reached the tank. The Japanese used the tank as a pillbox then, and it took hours to drive them off, stalling the whole advance again. Finally, on the 3rd day, the troops of the 106th reached the eastern end of the island, only after the ships had laid down a heavy barrage of fire. Admiral Hill and General Watson were thoroughly disgusted with the shabby performance of the army troops on Eniwetok, and so, although the Marines of the 22nd Regimental Combat Team were tired from bailing out the army on Eniwetok, General Watson decided he must use them to attack Parry Island rather than depend on the army. Hill had learned also that the intelligence estimates had been as wrong about the defences of Parry as they had been about Eniwetok Island, so the troops got the benefit of a much heavier advance shelling of Parry. The accuracy of the barrage was aided considerably by captured maps that showed the Japanese defence positions in detail. Japanese troops on Parry numbered 1,150, compared to the 800 on Eniwetok. The preparations for the Parry landings began on February 20th, when Marine artillerymen were landed on Japton Islet across the deep passage from Parry. For 3 days they fired against the Japanese positions. The artillery was augmented by fire from the 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and planes from the 3 escort carriers, Sangamon, Chenango, and Suwannee. The Army's 104th Field Artillery Battalion landed on Eniwetok and joined in. On the morning of February 21st, having made sure the west end of Eniwetok was cleared, the Marines of the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Regimental Combat Team were taken back to the transport Leonard Wood for a few hours of rest and the rehabilitation of their weapons before the Parry landing. The troops of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 22nd were brought down from Engebe, where the garrison forces had taken over. The Army's 3rd Battalion of the 106th would be held in reserve, but General Watson was so unsure of them that he organised a battalion of 500 Marine riflemen from the 10th Marine Defence Battalion, who would also be in reserve. Just before the invasion, it was discovered that the planning had been so inaccurate that the expedition was running out of ammunition. This lack was really no one's fault. There was no way the Americans could have known how many Japanese defenders they would meet on these islands. They had made the obvious guess that Engebe would be the major base, and General Nishida had outfoxed them by putting his major defences where they least expected them. So a hurried call was made to Kwajalein, and grenades and percussion caps for demolition charges were flown in. Parry Island is shaped like a raindrop, with the big end on the north. The Japanese had built 2 major defence works, among 8, on the northwest side of the island. The 22nd's 2nd Battalion would land near the north end on the west side and drive north to the end of the island. The 1st Battalion would land south of them and drive to the south end. Their tanks and infantry would cross the island to the ocean side and cut it in 2, thus isolating the 5 defensive areas in the south. The Navy and the artillery would lay down a barrage on the south to prevent reinforcements from coming up until the north end of the island was secure and the troops could turn south. The barrage opened at dawn on February 22nd. The troops landed at 9 o'clock in difficult conditions. The barrage had been so heavy for hours that the island was covered with smoke and haze, and it blew out over the lagoon, blinding the gunners of the cruisers and destroyers. Thus, when the troops came in, 3 of the leading LCIs that came ahead firing guns and rockets were hit by shell fire, and 60 men were killed or wounded by friendly fire. When the troops landed, some of the landing craft got out of position, and the front was widened. Unfortunately, instead of hitting the beaches between the 2 major northeast Japanese positions, the Marines landed in the middle of both of them, so well were they concealed. They came under fire by enfilading machine guns at the water's edge. These guns were soon enough silenced by grenades and shells from the amphibious tanks, and the Marines pushed inland. Again the Japanese retreated into their spiderwebs, so many of them and so artfully connected that the Marines compared Parry to a prairie dog town. These were the most elaborate spider webs the Americans had yet seen. The center of a spider web was an underground shelter for a dozen men, lined with coconut logs on the sides and roofed with logs and corrugated iron, covered by sand. Tunnels were made by opening gasoline drums and placing them end to end, and each tunnel led to a foxhole on the perimeter. Thus, a Japanese soldier could leave the central shelter and crawl to a foxhole that the Americans had bypassed and not seen because it usually was opened by a hatch cover concealed by a piece of brush. The soldier would stand up and fire at the rear of the Americans, and by the time they turned around he was down again, the foxhole covered, and crawling back to the central shelter to move out into another tunnel. There was only one way to clear the Japanese out: find the central shelter and destroy it, and then find each Japanese who might be in a tunnel or a foxhole and destroy him. Through their experience on Engebe and Eniwetok Islands, the Marines had developed an efficient tactic for dealing with these defences. A tank went ahead, firing its 75mm gun and machine guns. Immediately behind this shock force came demolition and flamethrower men, who stopped at each enemy nest and burned or blew it up. The system had worked well on Eniwetok. It worked less well on Parry, for the Japanese had put down landmines, which knocked the tracks off tanks and blew men apart. Until 11 o'clock, the invasion was supported by naval gunfire on the southern part of the island, but the troops moved swiftly, and the gunfire began hitting their positions, so it was stopped. The Japanese resisted firmly. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Marines had to call for reinforcements, and Marines from the boats came on in to help. At 1:30, the Marines reached the north end of Parry and isolated one last enemy position near the pier on the lagoon side. The 1st Battalion moved southward behind the tanks and kept slogging, using the same tactics: tank, flamethrowers, demolitions, riflemen taking a position and then moving on to the next, taking casualties, with replacements coming up to carry on as the wounded were carried back to the aid station, and the dead were left, with their rifles stuck in the sand to mark the place for the burial parties. The Marines did not wait for big guns to come up and blast positions or waste any time. They formed a skirmish line that extended across the island, and like beaters pushing the game ahead of them, they pressed on. Late in the afternoon, they came to an area of thick underbrush, where the Japanese had strewn scores of landmines. The Marines took heavy casualties, but they did not stop, and the resistance seemed to give them a sense of urgency. They pushed harder and faster until 7:30 that night, when they reached the end of the island and dug in for the night. Next morning they would mop up those Japanese left in their holes in the spider webs. That night, destroyers kept the island lighted up with searchlights and star shells. The Japanese tried to launch several counterattacks, but were quickly discovered in the light, and group after group was destroyed. When morning came, the tanks and infantry went over the whole island, looking for little pockets of resistance. They found a few Japanese in their holes, but most of them had either been killed or killed themselves the night before. By midday the island was quiet, and the Marines went back to their ships, leaving the troops of the 3rd Battalion of the 106th Army Infantry to take up garrison duties. In the Marines' opinion, that was about all the Army troops were good for, an opinion they were not bashful in expressing after the Eniwetok Island invasion. Admiral Hill shared that opinion, and so did many of his officers. Their own errors were forgotten in the success of the Eniwetok assault, but those of the Army were not, and the irritation between the Army and the naval services was increased when Hill and General Watson expressed their opinions to Howling Mad Smith, who already had a very bad impression of the Army's 106th Regiment's parent division, the 27th Infantry Division, and Major General Ralph Smith, the divisional commander. As far as the American public was concerned, this animosity was scarcely known, nor was it widely broadcast outside Pacific Command circles. Had the Army authorities in Washington been fully aware of the uncertainty of the 27th Division, they most certainly would have taken action at this point to make changes in command and training that would have prevented the chain of events that was to follow very shortly. All of them were occupied by fairly large garrisons. Since the Japanese were cut off from outside assistance, the garrisons were doing no harm to the Allied effort, so they were let alone, and many American lives were saved by not forcing the issue, as well as Japanese lives. In the South, General MacArthur was definitely relegated to a supporting role. He wanted to strike New Guinea, and after occupying the Dutch section of the island in the north, to leap off from there to recapture the Philippines. In a series of landings between April and August, MacArthur accomplished his first goal, but the eyes of the Joint Chiefs were not focused on the MacArthur operations, as he had hoped. The Joint Chiefs were enormously impressed with the effectiveness of the fast carriers and the speed with which the Central Pacific invasion operations had been accomplished. Further, the MacArthur strategy had called for a three-prong attack. He would drive up from the south, Nimitz would come from the east across the Central Pacific, and the British and the Americans would reopen the Burma Road into China and then drive to Hong Kong. But the British in 1944 were totally occupied by the coming invasion of the European continent across the English Channel and by their commitments in the Mediterranean. MacArthur's operational technique, the Army way, was far slower in motion than the Marine and Navy way, and in the spring of 1944 the Americans had a brand new weapon, the B-29 Superfortress, which could carry 10,000 pounds of bombs and take them farther than any aircraft in the world. The Americans built bases in western China, but it soon became apparent that the problem of supplying those bases and the distances were so great as to make the use of Xi'an and nearby areas of western China less than optimal. A very logical base for the new B-29s would be Saipan in the Marianas, and this was also logically the next invasion point for the Central Pacific forces. By the spring of 1944, Admiral Nimitz and King were certain that they could defeat Japan without the necessity of invading the Japanese home islands. The strategy called for movement into the Marianas, then toward the China coast. They might take Formosa on the way, which would give the US an enormous land base for air operations against Japan. But in all this, the Marianas were the next stop. With the coming of the B-29, Admiral King gained a new ally, General H. Arnold of the Army Air Forces, and this turned the trick. King could argue cogently that the Marianas represented the perimeter of the Japanese Inner Empire, and that their capture would aid immeasurably in bringing the war to a close. All this discussion occurred before, during, and after the Marshall invasion. General MacArthur tried to stop the plan. His Chief of Staff, Major General Richard K. Sutherland, appeared at the Cairo Conference shortly before the end of 1943 and presented the Joint Chiefs of Staff with the MacArthur Plan. MacArthur was to take over. Admiral Nimitz was to assist MacArthur, with MacArthur in charge, to attack Mindanao after the Marshalls. A Central Pacific offensive simply would not work, said General Sutherland. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff knew General MacArthur very well, and the Central Pacific Drive was approved. MacArthur made one last stab in February, but the Marshalls' invasion was so successful and so swift that General Sutherland's visit on behalf of his superior was unsuccessful. The JCS, in effect, told MacArthur to shut up and take orders. On March 12th, the Joint Chiefs issued a directive backing the Central Pacific approach to Formosa, Luzon, and China by way of the Marianas, the Carolines, Palau, and Mindanao. That order meant there would be two separate drives, one by Nimitz through the Central Pacific and one by MacArthur up through the Philippines. Truk, which had been singled out for invasion after the Marshalls, was discarded as a target after the Japanese combined fleet moved its headquarters north and west. Nimitz would invade the Marianas and after that the Palaus, which had become the new combined fleet base. As the Americans planned, so did the Japanese. Admiral Koga, chief of the combined fleet, went to Tokyo in February to confer with the Imperial General Staff, and he was there when the bad news came about the Marshalls and Truk. As the General Staff considered the fleet, it became apparent that the name Combined Fleet had become meaningless in view of the ship losses suffered by the Imperial Japanese Navy in recent months. In the battle for Guadalcanal, the Navy had lost two battleships, one light aircraft carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines. There was talk of brave plans to build 15 light carriers and 5 heavy carriers and convert the big battleship Shinano, one of the largest vessels in the world, to a carrier. But the construction was moving at a snail's pace because of lack of materials. In the months after Guadalcanal, the attrition to warships had been constant. To be sure, the Americans did not escape unscathed. They lost destroyers and cruisers and other vessels. But the Americans were building ships with ever-increasing speed. After the fall of 1943, shipbuilder Henry A. Kaiser turned out escort carriers in less than 90 days, and in 1944 was turning out escort carriers in just over 70 days from keel laying to completion. Admiral Koga, who had succeeded Admiral Yamamoto as Chief Operations Officer of the Japanese Navy after Yamamoto was ambushed by the Americans, knew as well as his predecessor that time was the enemy of Japan. The Navy's one chance of influencing the outcome of events was to attack the major elements of the American Pacific Fleet and win a great battle. After that, went the line of reasoning, the Americans would be stopped and would have to listen to reason, granting Japan an honourable peace. There was no more talk about winning the war in the private councils of the Imperial General Staff. That sort of verbiage was for the public. Koga offered a program of reorganization which showed the desperate straits of the Navy. For all practical purposes, the combined fleet would cease to exist. The mobile fleet would become the main body of the Navy. The Navy must expend its land-based air forces in the absence of adequate carriers and make Tinian Island in the Marianas the main base for the new force. The Navy must also move its fleet headquarters to Saipan, which would become the point beyond which the Americans must not be allowed to pass. But not even this program could be carried out. The fuel shortage had grown so severe that the mobile fleet could not be accommodated at Palau or at Saipan. Tokyo simply could not guarantee the tankers to keep the fleet in oil, so part of the fleet would be kept in the Singapore zone, close to the Dutch East Indies oil fields. Most of the rest of the major units would be retained in Japanese home waters for training. Admiral Koga, in his flagship Musashi, would remain at Palau. This agreement reached, Admiral Koga returned to Palau that month. He prepared a new defensive plan. The zone of inner defense of the Japanese Empire now extended on the east from the Kuriles in the north, down the east of Honshu Island in Japan, to the Nanpo Shoto Islands, then the Marianas and the Carolines, to the west end of New Guinea. Any enemy vessels or invasion groups that passed that line would bring forth the maximum effort of the fleet and the Japanese air arm. The Admiral then drew up plans on paper for the formation of a third aircraft carrier fleet in 3 divisions, each composed of 3 carriers. It looked very impressive, unless one knew that the 3rd division consisted of 2 converted tankers, Zuiho and Chitose, and Chiyoda, a converted naval auxiliary ship. Also, while the Japanese Navy still did have the big and impressive carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho, brand new, when Division 1 began training at Tawi-Tawi at the south end of the Sulu Sea, east of North Borneo, the 3 carriers had virtually no pilots who had taken part in earlier carrier operations. So many pilots had been lost at Midway and in succeeding operations that the supply of trained men was extremely short. Further, because of the need for skilled pilots to oppose the Americans in the South and Central Pacific, carrier pilots had been sacrificed wholesale in the past year. Between November 1943 and April 1944, almost the whole 1st Carrier Division had been lost in the Rabaul area. The 2nd Division had been decimated in the preliminaries to the Marshall Landings. The pilot force of the 3rd Division had not been organized until February 1944, and the men had only about 3 months' training, whereas their predecessors had had nearly a year, as compared to the American system of training for 18 months or 2 years before going into combat. The 22nd Air Squadron, for example, consisted of 10 pilots with some experience and 30 students. The squadron lost some planes in the American carrier attack on the Marianas on February 22nd, but within a matter of weeks, the Japanese were building up their air force there once more. Between February and May, the Navy would fly in 600 new aircraft of the 1st Air Fleet for the defense of the Marianas. Training was still a problem, but at any given moment, the Japanese were ready to put 400 planes in the air. The Navy was vying with the Army for aircraft, but Japanese industry was responding very well. By March 1944, 1,700 planes per month were being produced. All this effort was preparation for the major sea battle Admiral Koga expected and wanted. He developed Z-Plan, a strike against the American fleet the moment it entered the Philippine Sea, either from the south, along the New Guinea coast, or the northwest, via Palau or in the Marianas. Pilot recruiting led all branches. Admiral Koga wanted to be prepared to use 500 planes on the carriers and another 500 on the islands. The Z-Plan envisaged the use of island bases as shuttle stations for aircraft. Some planes would take off from the carriers, strike the American enemy, and then land on the islands to refuel. The island planes would do the same, landing on the carriers. Thus, the effectiveness of the Japanese Air Force would be increased by about 50%. The Koga plan also called for a strong defense force in all the perimeter islands. For years, the Japanese had maintained the cream of their military in Manchuria, on guard against Soviet entrance into the war. But the Soviets seemed totally uninterested in Manchuria these days, so the Imperial General Staff agreed that several divisions of troops could be moved to the defense of the Pacific perimeter. This reinforcement began in February. It was expensive in ships and lives, for the American submarines were becoming ever more aggressive and destructive, even inside the Japanese perimeter. On February 27th, the American submarine Greyback encountered a big convoy bringing troops down from Korea to the Marianas. The Greyback damaged one big transport, but was sunk herself that day. 2 days later, the Trout attacked the convoy and sank one ship that carried 4,000 troops. The Japanese were swift in vengeance. They sank the Trout that day. But the loss of the trained soldiers was something not easily remedied. In March 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance was at Kwajalein planning his invasion of the Marianas. He spent part of the month at Majuro and part of it at Pearl Harbor, checking details and conferring with Admiral Nimitz. He interrupted the planning toward the end of the month when General MacArthur requested a carrier raid on the Palau Islands to prevent them from reinforcing the Japanese in New Guinea. MacArthur was then ready to move against Hollandia on that island. On March 22nd, Admiral Spruance participated in the raid with carriers and fast battleships. Although he was the commander of the Fifth Fleet, the carrier force was not looking for surface action. The ships left Majuro on the 22nd, skirting around the Carolines to avoid detection by Japanese search planes. The Americans underestimated Japanese watchfulness, and on the third day out they were spotted by a plane from Truk. The next day, Admiral Spruance was sure they had been seen and advanced the day of the raid from April 1st to March 30th. As the fleet approached the Palaus, American submarines also arrived. On March 29th, the Tunny torpedoed the Musashi, Admiral Koga's flagship. The following dawn, carrier planes from 3 of the 4 American carrier groups hit the Palaus. For the next day and a half, the Americans flew hundreds of sorties over these islands, striking airfields and shooting down all planes they could find. Admiral Koga called for help from neighbouring islands, but planes from Peleliu and Yap were nearly all shot down. The next day, Admiral Reeves's group attacked Yap and destroyed more aircraft. American planes continued to strike Palau and laid traps for Japanese shipping in the inner harbours. Torpedo bombers sowed mines and sank the destroyer Wakatake and the repair ship Akashi. On April 1st, the carriers hit Walai in the Carolines. Scarcely a week later, they supported General MacArthur's move into Hollandia and knocked out more planes of Admiral Koga's defence force. By that time, the losses meant little to Koga. He had anticipated the Western New Guinea landing and arranged to send all available planes there, along with aircraft from Admiral Ozawa's carriers at Singapore. Koga left for Davao on the evening of March 31st to organise the force. Behind him in another plane came Admiral Fukudome, his chief of staff. The Japanese officers of the High Command were careful not to travel together. The wisdom of this caution was proven when the Americans ambushed Admiral Yamamoto the previous year. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, had been able to carry on until Admiral Koga was chosen as successor to the Combined Fleet Command. Koga was travelling in a two-engined general-purpose bomber, the usual command aircraft for the Japanese. En route, the air convoy encountered a violent storm. Admiral Fukudome's plane made an emergency night landing near Cebu City and crashed on the beach. Admiral Fukudome was captured by Filipino guerrillas and held hostage for several months until rescued by Japanese troops. Admiral Koga was killed, presumably by the storm, as the plane was never seen again. Koga had vowed to hold the line from the Marianas to Palau to the death. He had kept his vow, and his prediction remained true. The occupation of the Marshall Islands advanced the American drive through the Central Pacific by months. Coming quickly after the Gilbert's victory, it also played an important public role. These victories, plus the truck strike, were announced by a U.S. Navy department that had suddenly grown public relations conscious. General MacArthur was more responsible for this change in Navy policy than any other man. In Washington and from Australia, MacArthur lobbied incessantly for his own war plan. Secretary Frank Knox, a newspaper publisher in private life, was finally stung into revamping the Navy's press program. A directive was issued to Nimitz to be more cooperative with the press. Thus, the public had access to close-mouthed commanders like Nimitz and Spruance for the first time. Yet the most important value of the quick successive victories in the Gilberts and Marshalls was its effect on the Japanese. A year earlier, they could not envisage a cracking of their defensive line to eliminate Truk as the central point. In less than 12 months, this change had come about so swiftly that the Japanese had to live with the defences they had constructed in the pre-war years, and during the flush of victory in 1942, when defence was a term almost unknown. The decision to strike the Marianas was made during a meeting between Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz in San Francisco in January. The Commander-in-Chief of the Navy and his Pacific Fleet commander met about every 6 months, more often if necessary, to make basic decisions about strategy. These decisions were subject to ratification by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on major issues, but so far the Joint Chiefs had supported the King point of view on most matters. At San Francisco in January, King and Nimitz discussed the Marianas for the late months of 1944 or early 1945, not realizing that Eniwetok would fall to them long before the May date they had established. In the spring, as General MacArthur grew more aggressive in Washington to push his own war plan, the Marianas loomed as the last great naval operation in amphibious warfare that would be completely under naval command. King and Nimitz sensed the growing irritation of the army over supplying troops to be commanded by a Marine general. As long as the operations continued to be shock invasions, the use of Marines could be justified. But when they moved to Formosa, as they expected, or the China coast, Nimitz would have to turn over land operations to the army. What King and Nimitz intended was to use the Marines to land and then bring in the army generals to work under Nimitz. It was apparent early in 1944 that the system of command was in for a change once the Americans were faced with an assault on a major landmass. In March, Admiral King took the Marianas invasion plan to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and announced that the Navy was ready to move. He outlined the Navy reasons: the need for Guam and Saipan to become advanced air and naval bases, and the strategic consideration that capturing Saipan would leave the Japanese worried and unsure about the next American move. It opened the options of striking the Philippines, Formosa, or Okinawa. King called Nimitz to Washington, and when Nimitz returned to Pearl Harbor at the end of March, he ordered Admiral Spruance to begin the official planning. Actually, the work had already begun. Admiral Turner had come up from the Marshalls at the end of the 3rd week of March. He reviewed the maps and decided that Saipan would be the first objective, Tinian the 2nd, and Guam the 3rd. Spruance and Nimitz agreed, and the work began. The date would be June 15th. When Admiral Turner examined the maps and charts of the Marianas, he saw that the long period of Japanese mandate over these islands had produced the same difficulties he had faced in the Marshalls. He lacked information about the beaches, defences, tides, water depths, and natural and man-made obstacles. Some of these deficiencies could be remedied by photo reconnaissance. In April, a group of Navy B-24 Liberator bombers at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, was assigned the task of photographing every inch of the target islands. It meant flying 2,000 miles from their base with a halfway stop at Eniwetok. It was done, and the photographs arrived at Pearl Harbor in plenty of time. In mid-April, Admiral Nimitz decided a preventive strike was needed against Truk to ensure the Japanese did not build up their air power there before the Marianas invasion. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had been rebuilding their strength, and the reports were correct. Even though no new tactical commander had been appointed to replace Admiral Koga, the staff continued to function in accordance with his planning. On April 29th, an American Task Force 58 was off the Caroline Islands, and the first strike was launched against Truk. The Japanese put up more than 60 fighters to meet the 84 planes the Americans had sent out, but they missed one another in bad weather, so the initial impact was lost. The American fighters swooped down on the airfields and strafed installations and planes on the ground. The Japanese counterattacked, but the superiority of the new American fighter planes and the excellence of the longer U.S. pilot training made the difference. The raid lasted 2 days, and by the end of it, only a dozen Japanese aircraft were still operational. The American losses were not so heavy, 26 in combat and 9 operationally. Half the airmen shot down were rescued by planes or submarines. This factor was important in the increasing vigor of American attacks. The American airmen had come to expect that even if they were shot down in enemy waters, their chances of being picked up by their countrymen were excellent. In this operation, the submarine Tang picked up 22 airmen who otherwise would have perished in the sea or fallen into Japanese hands. Having smashed Truk so that it would never again be an important factor in Japanese defences, the task force turned to Satawan Island in the Carolines and Ponape, the largest of the group. There was nothing very important to the Japanese on either island, but Admiral W. A. Lee, the commander of the battleship force, felt his men needed some target practice. It was a measure of the state of the war in the Pacific that the American ships were using Japanese-held territory for target practice, without fear that the enemy fleet or air force would bother them. The fact was that the Japanese were then entirely occupied in this area by General MacArthur's invasion of central New Guinea. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, former commander of the Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan, was appointed early in May to replace Admiral Koga as operational chief of the Japanese fleet. His initial action was to develop a comprehensive battle plan, anticipating that the Americans would soon attempt to breach the internal defences of the empire. Toyoda's plan, known as the Eigo Plan, was designed to replace Koga's Z Plan and adhered to the Imperial General Staff's instructions. The Navy was to seek a decisive battle in the near future under favourable conditions. One of Toyoda's first major changes was the reorganization of the fleet. The effective fleet was renamed the Mobile Fleet and was commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, with his flagship being the carrier Taiho. The Mobile Fleet included the Third Fleet of carriers and the Second Fleet, consisting of battleships and cruisers. Ozawa commanded the Third Fleet and Carrier Division 1 himself, overseeing the Taiho, Zoikaku, and Shokaku, some of the best Japanese carriers. Carrier Division 2, led by Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, comprised the carriers Junyo, Hiyo, and Ryuho. Although inferior to Carrier Division 1's ships, they were still significant fighting instruments. The third element, Carrier Division 3, was commanded by Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi, and was equivalent to an American escort carrier group, consisting of converted vessels. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, aboard the cruiser Atago, commanded the Second Fleet. This fleet included the battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, along with the cruisers Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Myoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, and Chikuma. The fleet was considerable, augmented by light cruisers and several dozen destroyers. Given Admiral Koga's plan to use Pacific Island airfields as shuttle points for carrier operations, combined with a sufficient number of airplanes, the Japanese fleet could pose a formidable threat even to the powerful 5th United States Fleet with its fast carrier force. Success depended on Japan's ability to produce aircraft, effectively man them, and deploy them timely. To support this, Imperial headquarters relocated the Navy's first air fleet to Tinian, placing it under the direct command of Naval General Headquarters. This shift allowed airmen direct access to Tokyo, which was crucial for supply. Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta was appointed Commander-in-Chief of this force, with a promise of nearly 2,000 aircraft for the bases in the inner South Seas: Tinian, Guam, Saipan, Rota, Iwo Jima, Yap, and Palau. This force supplemented Admiral Ozawa's 450 carrier planes, making the Japanese strategy heavily reliant on the success of shuttle operations. By mid-April, planning encountered issues due to the capture of the Marshalls and the subsequent U.S. advance northward in the South Pacific, causing confusion about where the Americans would strike next. Admiral Kakuta had to frequently relocate his planes to address threats, from the southern Philippines to north of Australia, and then from Biak to Palau when Biak was attacked. Air transport became the only feasible option due to American submarine activity devastating sea lanes. However, the Japanese pilots were not adequately prepared, often having minimal solo flying time and little combat instruction. Despite producing advanced aircraft, around 80% were lost before reaching military action, some shot down en route, others through accidents and pilot error. By April, the carriers were nearly immobile due to a lack of a fleet commander. In May, Admiral Toyoda assumed command, with the fleet stationed at Tawi-Tawi on the northeastern tip of Borneo, allowing Admiral Ozawa to counter American threats to either the Palau Marianas area or farther south. Fuel shortages severely restricted operations, leading to a suspension of training flights in May, depriving inexperienced pilots of the chance to learn combat techniques. Everything was conserved for the anticipated, decisive battle. The Japanese were further disheartened by the vast American attack, which hindered ship and troop movements and the growing threat from American submarines. For instance, a convoy of over a division of troops sent to reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea lost one transport to an American submarine and later encountered the submarine Gurnard, which sank 3 more transports, destroying the division's strength before it could engage in combat. In the spring of 1944, the rapid American advances, including General MacArthur's attacks in New Guinea and various other locations, overwhelmed the Imperial General Staff. The Japanese decision to abandon the troops on Biak, communicated on May 9th, shocked the Navy as it was the largest force abandoned to certain destruction. Amidst these developments, the Japanese Navy saw an opportunity for a decisive battle in New Guinea. Rear Admiral Daniel Barbie, leading U.S. amphibious operations for MacArthur, assembled a fleet of 215 vessels protected by 8 escort carriers during the initial landings. Task Force 58's fast carriers and battleships further roamed the area. This situation led the Japanese to believe that the American naval force might be drawn into a major action off New Guinea. The invasion of Biak on May 27th triggered the Japanese plan, with the Navy preparing to fight at Biak. The Army reconsidered its abandonment of the Biak garrison, and reinforcements were assembled. The Navy ordered nearly 100 planes from Philippine and Marianas bases to Sorong on the northwest coast of New Guinea, where Rear Admiral Yoshioka Ito's 23rd Air Flotilla was located. A few days later, another 75 fighters and bombers were sent from the Carolines. Admiral Toyoda set aside the AGO operational plan and quickly devised a new plan to address this new situation. It was called the Con Plan. The 2nd Amphibious Brigade of 20,500 troops would be transported from Mindanao in the Philippines to Biak. The transports would be guarded by battleships, destroyers, and cruisers. The reinforced air flotilla would smash the American landing at Biak. The troops would assist the Biak garrison in driving the American soldiers into the sea, and the battleships and cruisers would destroy Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. All these forces were in motion on May 30th. The cruisers Miyoko and Haguro went to Davao, while the Ioba and the Kinu first went to Zamboanga to pick up the laden troop transports and then met the first two cruisers. The force then turned south toward Biak. On June 1st, Lieutenant Takehiko Chihaya reported from an aerial reconnaissance flight he had completed in the teeth of the enemy without detection. The Americans had built up Majuro in the Marshalls with an enormous number of ships of all sorts, suggesting that a new invasion was imminent. The Imperial General Staff was shocked. Where was the major action? It could be coming from Biak, Palau, or Saipan. With so many US ships in the New Guinea area and so many in the Marshalls, which was the major force? Aboard Admiral Toyoda's flagship, Oyodo, in Tokyo Bay, the naval staff debated, and the debate degenerated into argument. The truth was that no one knew, and no one had a clear sense of the American strategy, except one lone staff intelligence officer, Commander Chikataka Nakajima. He suggested Saipan, but his fellow staff members scoffed. They believed it could not be the case, as the Americans did not have the power to mount an operation as large as the three-pronged New Guinea strike as merely a feint. They thought Biak was the more likely target. If the Americans consolidated their landings, they could build an airfield from which they could bomb the Philippines and Palau with long-range B-24 Liberators. Additionally, the American carriers were evident off New Guinea, whereas no carriers were mentioned at Majuro. The carriers in New Guinea waters were escort carriers, which the Japanese often mistook for the large fleet carriers of Task Force 58. The task force was in Hawaiian waters, taking on supplies and training for the Marianas invasion. Commander Nakajima must be mistaken. It was either going to be Palau or Biak, and the staff was about evenly divided on that. Admiral Toyoda decided that Biak was the place, and the Cone operation continued. The enemy fleet would be met here and defeated once and for all. While the Japanese reacted to the Biak landings and debated the next course of action, Admiral Spruance at Pearl Harbor was assembling the largest force yet employed in the Pacific. A fleet of 535 ships would be engaged, everything from battleships to tugs, and this did not include the support available at Pearl Harbor and in the Marshalls on short notice. The ships would carry 127 the 500 men. First, they would capture Saipan and then Tinian with the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. The 3rd Marines and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade would attack Guam. The 27th Army Division would be held in reserve for Saipan, while the 77th Army Division would be in reserve for Guam. In May, the Hawaiian Islands were the scene of many mock battles. Troops practiced invading beaches on the neighbouring islands. The carriers and escort carriers sallied forth from Pearl Harbor to conduct mock battles and learn the techniques of supporting troops on the beaches. For many men of the escort carrier force, this would be their first battle entry. The same was true for the men of other ships, some of which would sail directly from the United States to join the expeditionary force at sea. The major battle rehearsal for the Saipan invasion was held between May 14th and May 20th, at Malaya Bay on Maui Island and Kahulawe, a deserted island used for bombardment and bombing practice. Admiral Turner's second-in-command, Rear Admiral Harry Hill, was particularly eager to try out a new weapon he had devised. Impressed with the success of rocket-firing vessels in the Marshalls' invasions, he had equipped 3 tank landing craft, LCTs, with half a dozen 4.2-inch mortars. These gunboats were intended to protect the left flank of the landing force on Saipan from potential reinforcements. The final test would be their performance in the manoeuvres. On the night of May 14th, when the invasion fleet sailed for Maui, the weather was very rough off Pearl Harbor. 2 of the special LCTs broke free from their lashings aboard the LSTs transporting them and sank. Several lives were lost, and Admiral Turner cancelled the whole proposition, as it was too late to build up another pair of LCTs and reorganize the safety procedures for shipping them. After the exercise, LST-353, carrying the last of the experimental gunboats, was ordered into Pearl Harbor's West Loch to unload 2,500 mortar projectiles that had been put aboard for the gunboat operation. LST-353 moored in West Loch near the Naval Ammunition Depot next to 16 other LSTs designated as ammunition ships. The mortars and the ammunition belonged to the army, so trucks were sent from Schofield Barracks to pick up the ordnance, and a black Labour battalion was sent to move the material. It was a hard job, as the LCT had been loaded with 40 tons of ammunition. The civilian dock workers at Pearl Harbor were not always as careful as they should have been about smoking around live ammunition. That day, an officer of LST 353 had to order 2 civilians on deck to stop smoking. However, just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as members of the Labour battalion were loading ammunition onto one of the trucks, there was an explosion, followed by 2 more explosions. Debris rained down on all the nearby LSTs, which were loaded with ammunition and gasoline drums on deck. A burning fragment ignited a gasoline fire, leading to an enormous explosion aboard the LST involved. Others began to burn as well. The sky above Pearl Harbor was black and grey with smoke, and flames shot hundreds of feet in the air. Aboard LST 353 and other ships, the men tried to fight the fires, but the power was out and the hoses wouldn't work. The explosions and fires continued, and in Honolulu, many people believed the Japanese had attacked again by air. This belief persisted for years. In 1979, the Gannett News Service in Washington erroneously reported a second Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on May 21, 1944. Admiral Turner, whose invasion was at stake with the ammunition ships, came to Westlock and supervised the firefighting personally. He became so emotional that when a boatswain's mate commanding a yard tug backed away from the ammunition dock, the admiral threatened to shoot him. By the time the fires were out and the smoke cleared, the Navy had lost 6 LSTs loaded with ammunition, with 163 men killed and 396 injured. It was a serious disaster. Coming just on the eve of the invasion made it even worse, as Admiral Turner was uncertain if other ships could be found to replace these. However, ships were found and loaded quickly, and the Saipan invasion proceeded on schedule. On June 6th, Admiral Spruance sailed in the Indianapolis for Eniwetok. The slower ships were already on their way, protected by the escort carriers, and other ships were coming in from the west coast to converge in the Marshalls and then move to the Marianas. Admiral Spruance learned that a Japanese search plane had reconnoitred Majuro. Since the carrier task force had arrived there, the Japanese must have known about the fleet, but they still did not know where the Americans were headed. Admiral Toyoda was still betting that the point of action was south around Biak. On June 8th, Admiral Turner's Saipan Expeditionary Force arrived at Eniwetok. Spruance conferred with Turner briefly, and then the Indianapolis sailed, taking him to join Task Force 58, which would open the invasion with airstrikes against the Marianas. The next day, Spruance approved Admiral Mitcher's plans to conduct a 208-plane fighter sweep over Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan Islands. Mitcher knew the Japanese had been reinforcing the Marianas with new planes and wanted to hit them hard before the invasion forces were seen and could get into trouble. Day was set for June 15th. Mitcher wanted this first sweep at 0600 and the second the next morning at Tinian and Saipan, which he concluded had the most planes. On June 9th, another enemy search plane was spotted over Majuro, so Admiral Spruance concluded that the Japanese knew the carrier force had sailed. To confuse the enemy, airstrikes by Admiral Hoover's land-based air force were arranged on Palau, Truk, and other areas in the south. These bombings helped keep Admiral Toyoda guessing. On June 10th, the Central Pacific Command perceived much greater air activity by the Japanese in all areas, and Admiral Mitcher asked permission to launch his strikes a day early in view of the apparent Japanese discovery of the American plans. But the Japanese on that day were still occupied with the Kun operation, half expecting to see the American fleet come forth in strength to challenge them. Admiral Kincaid was sure the Japanese were planning a major naval move, and in the first week of June he was certainly correct. The 23rd Air Flotilla had been augmented by 200 aircraft, and the pressure on the American landings and ships off Biak was heavy. The cruisers Australia, Phoenix, Boise, and Nashville, along with 14 American and Australian destroyers, were out scouting to fight if they met equal or inferior forces, and give warning if they met superior forces. On June 5th, Japanese planes attacked Allied aircraft at Wakde Island, where they were packed on the runways, and did such severe damage that Wakde was useless for most of the next week. The Japanese destroyer force and the Allied cruiser force met only in a brushing action on June 8th, and the Japanese retired before superior strength. The destroyer Harusame was lost to a flight of American medium bombers, but the fleet action was inconclusive when the Japanese ran north. The information about this action reached Tokyo and persuaded Admiral Toyoda to commit his major forces to the Kon plan. The big battleships Yamato and Musashi, with their 18-inch guns, were ordered to sail from Tawi-Tawi to join the cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Ugaki in Yamato sailed that afternoon. On the evening of June 1st, a large force had assembled at Batyan, the Japanese base south of Halmahera, about 200 miles west of New Guinea. But that night, Admiral Toyoda received news from Saipan about the air attacks that day. The next day was the same. Toyoda knew then that the major attack was going to be on the Marianas, and he switched gears. Operation Kon was suspended, and Operation Eigo was to be carried out immediately. Admiral Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet, had remained behind at Tawi-Tawi with the 9 aircraft carriers, waiting for definitive word on the direction of the big battle. On June 13th, he sailed. There was no further question in anyone's mind about the objective of the Americans. Admiral Turner's pre-invasion bombardment of Saipan had begun.